United States Army presents The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
The United States Army is proud to focus the big picture camera on its sister service, the United States Navy. In telling the story of one of its most distinguished wartime leaders, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. The Nimitz story is not simply the account of an outstanding naval officer who rose to a position of greatness and honor. It is also the chronicle of our modern Navy, its coming of age, and its greatest triumph in the epic struggle for the Pacific during World War II. For just as many of our Navy's greatest victories resulted from Nimitz's brilliant planning and bold strategy, so Nimitz himself is the embodiment of the finest tradition of naval service. The Nimitz story begins before the turn of the century. Far from the ocean he would one day command.
Texas was a prospering state in 1885 when Chester Nimitz was born in the tiny town of Fredericksburg. There was room on the great western plains where a man could run cattle or farm and grow with America. Nimitz's people were pioneer stock, and their faith in their country's future formed the bedrock of their children's heritage. Although his pioneering grandfather had once followed the sea, there was little else in the boy's landlocked environment to point him towards the Navy. But while Nimitz grew, America's Navy grew too. The 100-year-old Constellation was still in use to train men during the Spanish-American War. But our sea battles were fought by revolutionary armored steam warships. There were many spokesmen for the new Navy, not the least of them Theodore Roosevelt. Ours was still a young country, and it was a two-ocean country. The Navy, which had sent the Spanish fleet to the bottom, was necessary to our defense and to our future security. The year Teddy Roosevelt entered the White House, young Chester Nimitz entered the Naval Academy. The future Fleet Admiral had never seen an ocean when he journeyed east. But like all young men away from home, he soon became accustomed to his new environment. He learned the Navy from the keel up and grew to love the tough and demanding life he shared with his fellow midshipmen. The physical training was as rigorous as the bookwork. At a school where the traditions of Jones and Decatur, Porter and Dewey governed a midshipman's life. Although American naval tradition ran back to the Revolution, the service itself during Nimitz's days at Annapolis looked to the future. New ideas on the importance of sea power, new fighting techniques and weapons were making their mark. A young man could not only see the world in the new Navy, he could find the broadest possible challenge to his imagination. The day of wooden ships had passed, but iron men were needed more than ever. Nimitz was graduated 7th in a class of 114. Regulations required him to serve 2 years at sea as a passed midshipman before becoming an ensign in the regular Navy. This early technological marvel, one of our first submarines, was being tested for the Navy at the time Chester Nimitz joined the fleet. After duty in the Far East during the first few years of his career, Nimitz was selected with other outstanding young men to form what eventually became our Navy's submarine force. In vessels not far removed from this primitive model, Lieutenant Nimitz learned a difficult and dangerous profession. There were few books and no men of experience. You learned the only way you could, by doing it yourself. Lieutenant Nimitz wrote prophetically in a naval journal of 1912, "Improvement in the size, motive power and speed of the submarine craft of the near future will result in a most dangerous offensive weapon. His prediction would be borne out by the importance of submarine action in the First World War. By 1918, Nimitz was one of the most experienced submariners in the service and a commander. But a broad and varied background was essential to a man's career in the complex Navy. And the best place to acquire it was the surface fleet. Nimitz, when a captain, went on to command major warships in the 20s and 30s, including the cruisers Chicago and Augusta. During these years, he had full opportunity to study the kind of sea and air operations which later proved so successful in the war against Japan. In these same decades, the Japanese constructed one of the finest fleets the world had ever seen. On the fateful day of December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy was ready. The flames had hardly died before Chester Nimitz was called from a desk in Washington to take command of the Pacific Fleet. It was a dark time and a formidable task. It would take a man of vast experience and vigor to bring both hope and victory out of wreckage and chaos. It would take a Nimitz. The Japanese quickly followed their surprise success at Pearl Harbor with territorial grabs across the Western Pacific as American forces fought and lost against overwhelming odds. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled most of the land and dominated the sea and air west of Pearl Harbor. It was up to our Navy to hold the line. But if we underestimated the Japanese, they also underestimated us. When they disabled the cream of our fleet at Pearl Harbor, they did not realize that we could recover so quickly. While we recovered strength, our submarines carried the fight to the enemy's waters. The silent service that Nimitz had helped build now served him well. It would become the lance that would cut the enemy's arteries. The saga of these gallant vessels is among the most inspiring in the heroic annals of the Navy.